Welcome back, romance lovers. We have an absolutely incredible story lined up for you today, packed with hilarious banter, slow burn tension, and a very stubborn alpha king. The team has been working non-stop to bring this audiobook to life, and we cannot wait for you to hear it. Before we dive into Chapter 1, we want to invite you to become an official part of our community by joining the channel membership. When you click that join button below, you will unlock amazing membership perks like early access to new episodes, exclusive looks at our master character design sheets, and members-only polls. Your support means everything to us and helps our team keep bringing these amazing romances to your screens. Now, get comfortable, and let's get into the story. Chapter 1. The structural integrity of the croquembouche was failing. "Hold the base," I hissed into my headset, aggressively shoving a rogue cream puff back into the leaning tower of pastry. "Brenda, I swear to God, if you don't bring me the edible glue right now, I am going to restructure your employment contract into a paper airplane." My wrist screamed in protest, a familiar ache of chronic carpal tunnel, but I held the frosting together with sheer, cynical willpower. I didn't need help. I was Sloane. I handled logistics. I did not rely on anyone, least of all Brenda, who was currently weeping over a misplaced floral arrangement in the coat check. A massive shadow fell over my meticulously organized catastrophe. "The angle of the base is mathematically unsound," a deep, completely deadpan voice observed. I blinked, slowly turning my head. Standing there, looking like a GQ model who had been aggressively starched, was the Alpha King, Gideon. He didn't roar. He didn't exude feral, uncontrolled dominance. He simply stood perfectly still, holding a terrifyingly thick, color-coded binder with the posture of a man preparing for a hostile corporate takeover. "I'm sorry," I said, wiping a smear of buttercream off my clipboard. "Did I hire a structural engineer, or are you just heavily invested in my pastry-based suffering?" "Neither," Gideon replied, his expression entirely blank. He dropped the massive binder onto the linen-draped table with a heavy, definitive thud. "I am here to hire you for the Decade Unity Retreat." I stared at the binder. It had to be 400 pages. Absolutely not. I am booked. "And frankly, your PAX council has a reputation for micromanaging." "My council is threatening a vote of no confidence if I fail to socialize properly with the human factions," Gideon stated, as if announcing the weather. "I require a logistical coordinator to manage the retreat. You are highly efficient, and you are currently saving a pastry tower with nothing but spite. I require that energy." I let out a breathless, sarcastic laugh, finally stepping back as the croquembouche stabilized. "Look, Your Majesty, I don't do socialization crises. I deal in facts, spreadsheets, and venues. I don't do feelings. And I definitely don't work with alphas who think a conversation is a line item on a budget." Gideon didn't blink. He just stared at me, his gaze tracking the chaotic, messy bun on my head down to my frosting-covered blazer. There was no sensory overload, no primal growling. Just cold, calculating assessment. "Name your price," he said quietly. "Fine. If he wanted to play the bureaucratic tyrant, I would press him out." "Triple my standard corporate rate," I snapped. "Plus a hazard fee for dealing with shifter politics. Paid up front. Acceptable," Gideon said without a single hesitation. "Wait, what?" Before my brain could catch up to my mouth, he reached into his perfectly tailored jacket, pulled out a sleek silver pen, and signed the final page of the contract in his binder. He slid it across the table toward me. "Your signature," he demanded mildly. Driven by a fatal mix of sleep deprivation and the sheer shock of that number, I scribbled my name on the dotted line. The second the ink dried, Gideon snapped the binder shut. He didn't smile, but there was a distinct, terrifying glint of satisfaction in his dark eyes. He reached into his pocket and handed me a single, sharply printed sheet of paper. "What is this?" I asked, a sudden cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. "Our itinerary," Gideon said, turning on his heel with a slight, almost imperceptible hitch in his step. "I will see you at the coffee shop for our first venue briefing. Tomorrow morning, at 5 o'clock. He walked away, leaving me standing alone with a frosting-covered clipboard. Oh no, I stared at the itinerary, my pulse spiking as the reality of what I had just done washed over me. I have made a terrible mistake. Chapter 2. At 4:56 a.m., the city was nothing but a cold, unforgiving void of neon streetlights and regret. I stood inside the daily grind, clutching a lukewarm black coffee like it was a life preserver. My laptop bag dug a trench into my shoulder, and my eyes were burning. I did not do mornings. I did logistics, and logistics did not technically exist until at least 8 o'clock, precisely at 5. Not a minute before, not a minute after. The bell above the door chimed. Gideon walked in. He was wearing a charcoal three-piece suit that looked like it had been tailored by a laser. His dark hair was meticulously parted, and his expression was as unreadable as a blank spreadsheet. There was no grogginess in his posture, no sign that he was a biological creature who required sleep. He simply scanned the room, his sharp eyes taking in the espresso machines, the pastry case, and finally me. "You are 4 minutes early," Gideon noted, stopping 2 feet away. His voice was a low, steady baritone that vibrated right through the heavy acoustic jazz playing on the overhead speakers. "And you are entirely too conscious." I shot back, taking a defensive sip of my coffee. "Who schedules a venue briefing at dawn? The human dignitaries are available for negotiations at noon," Gideon replied smoothly, adjusting his cuffs. He didn't look at my sleep-deprived, chaotic energy with disdain. He looked at it like data he was trying to process. "Therefore, we must finalize the secondary location parameters before 9. Optimization requires sacrifice." "I am going to optimize my clipboard against your skull," I muttered. Gideon ignored the threat. Instead, he turned his attention to the barista behind the counter, a teenager who was currently fumbling with a stack of paper cups. "Their workflow is entirely inefficient," Gideon stated, his tone deadpan. "The espresso machine is 3 steps too far from the syrup station. If they shifted the layout, they could decrease transaction time by 14%. I should speak to the manager." "Do not traumatize the barista." "Your Majesty," I snapped, rubbing my temple. "We are not here to restructure a small business. We are here to review the suburban estate." I unzipped my bag, my wrist giving a sharp throb of protest as I yanked out a file. "Let's just go over the..." I turned sharply on my heel. It was a fatal miscalculation. My shoe caught the edge of a completely, undeniably flat rug. Physics abandoned me. The clipboard flew out of my hands, sending 50 pages of color-coded schedules raining into the air. I braced myself for the humiliating impact of the hardwood floor, but the impact never came. A hand clamped around my waist. The grip was shockingly firm, arresting my fall in a fraction of a second. I gasped, my hands flying up and landing flat against Gideon's chest. The fabric of his suit was crisp, but beneath it he felt like solid iron. He hadn't just caught me. He had completely absorbed my momentum, pulling me flush against his side to keep us both upright. For a man who treated every interaction like a corporate merger, the physical proximity was dizzying. I could smell his cologne, clean cedar, sharp rain, and something fundamentally wild beneath the expensive soap. "Are you malfunctioning?" Gideon asked softly. His face was mere inches from mine, his dark eyes wide with genuine bewilderment. "I know," I stammered, my heart doing a chaotic, uncoordinated sprint against my ribs. The rug was structurally unsound. "It is entirely flat," he pointed out. "It was plotting against me," I insisted, trying to step back. As I pulled away, Gideon shifted his weight to his right leg and immediately flinched. A sharp, barely audible hiss escaped his teeth. He quickly masked it, adjusting his stance, but I saw the awkward hitch in his posture. The legendary, bureaucratic Alpha King was hiding a limp. He cleared his throat, his expression instantly locking back into its impenetrable, deadpan mask. "We should proceed to the car. The estate is a 40-minute drive." He turned and walked toward the door, his gait just a fraction off-center. I stood frozen in the middle of the coffee shop, staring at his broad shoulders. My skin was still burning where his hand had gripped my waist, and a terrifying irrational thought pierced through my caffeine-deprived brain. "Oh God, he's not a robot. He's real." Chapter 3. By 9 o'clock, I was convinced the universe was actively punishing me for my arrogance. "You assured me this venue had pristine botanical aesthetics," Gideon said. "It did," I yelled over the deafening roar of rushing water. "On paper." The PDF was very convincing. We were standing in the middle of the renowned suburban pack grounds, a sprawling, gorgeous outdoor estate that was supposed to host the secondary human shifter mixer. Instead, it was currently hosting a catastrophic plumbing failure. 10 minutes into our tour, a massive underground pipe had burst, turning the immaculate lawn into a high-pressure swamp. "Run!" I shrieked, clutching my laptop bag to my chest as a geyser of muddy water shot 10 feet into the air, raining down on us. We scrambled across the soaked grass, diving under the only available shelter, a tragically small, wrought iron gazebo. I collapsed onto the wooden bench, gasping for air. My blazer was soaked. My carefully constructed messy bun was now just messy. I looked like a drowned, incredibly stressed rat. I glanced over at Gideon. Even in a crisis, the man was infuriatingly composed. His charcoal suit was splattered with mud, and water dripped from his meticulously parted hair. But he was standing perfectly upright, calculating the volume of the flood. "The structural integrity of their irrigation system is severely lacking," Gideon observed, wiping a drop of muddy water off his cheek. "I will have to deduct this from their vendor fee." "A pipe exploded, Gideon," I groaned, shivering violently as a gust of cold morning wind swept through the open gazebo. "You can't spreadsheet an exploding pipe. This is a disaster. I'm going to have to find a new venue in less than 3 weeks." "We will secure an alternative," he said smoothly. He finally turned to look at me, his calm facade breaking just a fraction as he took in my violently shivering form. His jaw tightened. Without a word, he stepped forward. He stripped off his ruined, heavy suit jacket. He didn't ask for permission, and he didn't make a grand, dominant show of it. He simply stepped into my space, wrapping the thick, warm fabric around my trembling shoulders. I froze. The jacket was massive on me, completely enveloping my upper body. It still held his body heat, radiating a shocking amount of warmth against my damp skin. But it wasn't just the heat, it was the scent, cedar, rain, safety. It hit my senses like a freight train. My hyper-independent brain immediately tried to reject it. Do not rely on this. Do not find comfort in this. I was a professional. I was the vendor, and he was the client. "I don't need your coat," I said, my voice shaking, though whether from the cold or the proximity, I couldn't tell. "I'm fine. You're going to freeze." "I run approximately 4 degrees warmer than a human baseline," Gideon replied, his voice dropping into that low, steady register. He didn't step back. He stayed right in front of me, his hands lingering on the lapels of the jacket, just inches from my collarbone. Logically, it is the most efficient distribution of resources. I looked up. His dark eyes were locked onto mine, intense and entirely unreadable. We were trapped in a space no larger than a walk-in closet, surrounded by a wall of falling water. There were no spreadsheets here, no binders, no council members. "Efficient," I whispered, the sarcasm completely draining from my voice. Gideon's gaze dropped to my lips for a fraction of a second. "Highly." My heart gave a violent, erratic thud against my ribs. The cold completely vanished, replaced by a suffocating, terrifying heat. My brain short-circuited entirely, leaving me staring up at the bureaucratic king, realizing with sheer panic that the logistical walls I had built around myself were already starting to crack. At 11:30 p.m., the neon skyline of the city poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Gideon's corporate office, casting long shadows across the sterile, glass-topped desk. I was currently engaged in the most intense intellectual battle of my life. "You cannot put the human ambassador of trade at table 4, I argued, aggressively tapping the end of my pen against the glowing monitor. "Table 4 is next to the kitchen doors. He will be hit in the back of the heads by a swinging tray of bruschetta, and he will declare war. Table 4 is strategically positioned near the exit for optimal security protocols," Gideon countered. He was leaning back in his ergonomic chair, his tie loosened, a shocking deviation from his usual rigidity, and his sleeves rolled up to the elbows. Furthermore, the ambassador is allergic to shellfish. Placing him far from the main buffet mitigates the risk of cross-contamination. "It's a diplomatic mixer. Gideon, not a hospital triage," I groaned, dropping my face into my hands. My carpal tunnel was screaming. My eyes were vibrating from the blue light, and we had been arguing over the seating chart for 5 hours. "You are allowing emotion to dictate logistical placements," Gideon said, his voice a low, infuriating hum of calm reason. "I am allowing common sense to dictate it," I snapped. I pushed myself out of my chair. Exhaustion had completely eroded my professional filter. I marched around the edge of the massive glass desk, leaning over his shoulder to grab the wireless mouse. "Look," I said, pointing at the screen. "If you move the ambassador to table 2, you buffer him with the shifter logistics council. They can talk about tax brackets, no one gets hit with a door, and everyone survives the night." "The logistics council will bore him to death," Gideon murmured. "Exactly, it's foolproof." I cut myself off. I suddenly realized exactly where I was. By leaning over his shoulder to reach the mouse, I had boxed myself in. My arm was brushing against his. The heat rolling off his body was palpable, cutting through the over-air-conditioned chill of the corporate office. I turned my head to apologize, to step back into my safe, designated vendor zone, and realized Gideon had turned his head too. Our faces were inches apart. The sharp, witty retort died in my throat. Up close, the sterile, unreadable Alpha King was alarmingly human. I could see the faint shadow of exhaustion under his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw, and the slow, steady pulse beating at the base of his throat. The silence in the office became deafening, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the HVAC system. "Sloan," Gideon said quietly. It was the first time he had used my actual name instead of calling me the coordinator. It sounded entirely too intimate rolling off his tongue. "What?" I breathed, my grip on the edge of the desk tightening until my knuckles turned white. Gideon didn't move away. He didn't adjust his posture or spout a statistical fact. His dark eyes flicked down, mapping the curve of my mouth with terrifying, mathematical precision. He was close enough that I could feel the faint brush of his breath against my jaw. "Your seating logic," Gideon's voice was a rough, quiet gravel that sent a heavy shiver straight down my spine, "is deeply flawed." He slowly raised his hand, his knuckles brushing a stray lock of hair away from my cheek. The contact was electric, burning right through my exhaustion. The tension snapped tight, winding so high I couldn't pull air into my lungs. He was looking at my lips. He was going to close the distance. He was going to completely ruin my life, my business, and my heavily guarded independence. And heaven help me, I was going to let him. My survival instinct finally kicked in, violently overriding the gravitational pull of the Alpha King. I ducked completely under his outstretched arm, gasping for air as if I had just broken the surface of a frozen lake. "Table 2, I squeaked, snatching my laptop off the glass desk with shaking hands. "Table 2 is a mathematically flawless compromise. The ambassador lives. The shifters talk taxes." Meeting adjourned. Gideon's hand hovered in the empty air for a fraction of a second. Slowly, his fingers curled into a loose fist before dropping to his side. His expression shuddered, the terrifying vulnerability vanishing behind his impenetrable corporate mask. "Agreed," he said, his voice entirely devoid of the gravelly heat from moments before. "I will see you at the Jubilee Festival at noon to scout the catering trucks." 14 hours later, the Midsummer Jubilee Festival in the city park was a logistical nightmare. The air was thick with the scent of fried dough, ozone, and unwashed crowds. Thousands of humans and shifters were crammed onto the sun-baked pavement, swarming the food stalls while a violently loud indie band assaulted a set of blown-out speakers. My contacts had declared war on my retinas after staring at screens all night, forcing me to wear my heavy tortue-shell glasses. "The crowd density here violates at least 6 fire codes," Gideon noted loudly over the baseline. He was walking half a step behind me, surveying the chaotic sea of bodies with deep, bureaucratic disdain. "It's a festival, Gideon, not a military parade," I shouted back, aggressively checking off a vendor on my clipboard. "People like chaos. Chaos is merely a failure of planning," he replied dryly. Before I could hurl a sarcastic retort, a group of teenagers playing aggressively competitive frisbees barreled through the crowd. Someone's elbow slammed hard into my shoulder. I stumbled, the clipboard flying from my grip, and my glasses were knocked completely off my face. The world instantly dissolved into a terrifying impressionistic blur of neon colors and shoving bodies. Panic spiked in my chest. "Wait. Don't step there." I dropped to my knees, blindly patting the filthy pavement as heavy boots stomped dangerously close to my fingers. Suddenly, a solid, immovable wall of heat bracketed my back. Gideon didn't shout. He simply stepped over me, planting his feet wide and turning his broad shoulders against the rushing tide of the crowd. He acted as a physical breakwater, absorbing the shoves and complaints of the festival-goers without budging a single inch. I heard his breath hitch, a sharp intake of air as his bad leg took the brunt of a passing impact. But he held his ground like a stone pillar. "Do not move, Sloane," he ordered, his low voice slicing straight through the ambient noise. Within seconds, his large hand closed over my wrist. He pulled me up, simultaneously pressing my intact glasses firmly into my palm. I shoved them onto my face. The world snapped back into focus. Gideon was standing directly in front of me, his jaw locked in a hard line as he glared down a terrified human who had bumped his shoulder. "I'm fine," I breathed, my hands trembling as I brushed dust off my jeans. "I don't need—" "You are shaking," Gideon interrupted. He didn't step back into his designated client zone. Instead, his hand slid down from my shoulder, settling firmly against the curve of my waist. He gently but securely pulled me to his side, shielding me from the main thoroughfare of the crowd. "The flow of foot traffic is highly irregular," he murmured, his thumb resting just above my hip bone. "It is logically sound for us to maintain structural proximity." I stared up at his sharp profile. The excuse was pure deadpan bureaucracy, but his touch was incredibly gentle. I leaned into his side, completely bypassing my usual sarcastic defense mechanisms. The scent of cedar and rain enveloped me, shutting out the noise of the festival. I didn't push him away. Worse, I didn't want to. I realized with a suffocating spike of terror that for the first time in my fiercely independent life, I felt completely safe relying on someone else. The atmosphere inside Lorchide was designed to make you feel fundamentally unworthy of being there. The lighting was so dim it required echolocation. The minimalist decor looked like a modern art exhibit on despair, and the maitre d' had judged my off-the-rack blazer with a single devastating arch of his eyebrow. "Remember the protocol," I hissed out of the corner of my mouth as we were escorted to a velvet booth. "Chef Henri is an eccentric romantic. He only books his venue for couples he believes are fated. So look intensely at me, smile, and try not to sound like a tax auditor." "I am perfectly capable of simulating romantic attachment," Gideon said, adjusting his perfectly tailored suit jacket as he sat across from me. "It is merely a data exchange of mutual appreciation." I dropped my head onto the impossibly crisp linen tablecloth. "We are doomed." Chef Henri appeared out of the shadows like a theatrical ghost, wielding a tray of violently complex amuse-bouches. He was a towering, heavily tattooed human who viewed culinary arts as a blood sport. "So," Henri began, crossing his massive arms and glaring at Gideon, "you wish to rent my entire establishment for a private retreat. Tell me, what is the nature of your passion? Why her?" I kicked Gideon's shin under the table. "Do not talk about my work ethic," I prayed silently. "Do not mention my filing system." Gideon cleared his throat. He sat perfectly straight, fixing Henri with a deadpan stare. "Her bone density is excellent." I choked on my own saliva. Henri's left eye twitched. "She also possesses an aggressive stress management protocol that I find highly efficient," Gideon continued, completely oblivious to the catastrophic failure of this charade. "Our mutual tax brackets, while disparate, are complementary in a long-term fiscal projection." "He's joking," I interrupted frantically, letting out a high-pitched, hysterical laugh. I reached across the table, desperately grabbing Gideon's hand to sell the lie. His skin was shockingly warm, his large fingers completely dwarfing mine. "My fiancé has a very dry sense of humor. He's so shy about his feelings." Henri narrowed his eyes, clearly unconvinced. "Is that so? Then look at her alpha. Drop the spreadsheets. Tell me what you actually see." The command hung in the heavy, candlelit silence. I looked at Gideon, offering a small, apologetic grimace. I expected him to pivot back to his statistics. I expected him to calculate a polite, surface-level compliment about my hair or my dress. Instead, Gideon turned his hand over, intertwining his fingers with mine. His grip was firm, anchoring me to the table. He didn't look at the chef. His dark, intense gaze locked entirely onto my face, the amber candlelight flickering in his eyes. The corporate mask vanished. "I see a woman who refuses to surrender," Gideon said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly hum that vibrated right through the heavy oak table. "She is chaotic. She talks entirely too fast." But she builds order out of nothing but sheer, uncompromising will. She is terrified of failing, yet she carries the weight of everyone else's incompetence without breaking. My breath hitched. The ambient noise of the restaurant completely flatlined. "She does not need me," Gideon whispered, his thumb slowly stroking the back of my hand, sending a dangerous electric heat straight up my arm. "And yet, she is the most formidable, brilliant intellect I have ever encountered. To be allowed in her presence is not a partnership, it is a privilege." Chef Henri gasped dramatically, clapping his hands to his chest. "Magnifique! The venue is yours!" Henri vanished back into the kitchen, shouting in French. I sat frozen, completely paralyzed by the weight of Gideon's words. I tried to pull my hand back to laugh it off, to say, "Great acting, Your Majesty." But the words wouldn't form. Gideon didn't release my hand. He held it firmly beneath the glow of the candle, his eyes never leaving mine, leaving me entirely speechless and terrified that he hadn't been acting at all. "You are too intense," I declared, slamming a handful of brass tokens onto the sticky neon-lit counter. "I secured the venue," Gideon replied mildly, eyeing the peeling carpet of Galaxy Quest Arcade as if it were an active biohazard. "My methods were effective." "Your methods almost gave me a cardiac event," I shot back, rubbing my chest where my heart was still hammering an erratic, panic-induced rhythm. The air smelled aggressively of ozone, cheap pepperoni pizza, and teenage angst. "If you look at the human press at the Unity Gala the way you looked at me in that restaurant, they won't vote for you. They will spontaneously combust. You need to learn how to smile naturally." "I smile," Gideon stated flatly. "Gideon, earlier today a child dropped an ice cream cone in front of you, and you looked at it like it was a breach of contract. We are going to fix your PR problem right now." I grabbed his elbow, ignoring the jolt of heat beneath his expensive wool sleeve, and dragged him past a row of blinking pinball machines. I stopped in front of the holy grail of arcade diplomacy, the ski-spall lanes. "The rules are simple," I said, handing him a wooden ball. "Throw it up the ramp. Hit the target. Pretend you are having a normal human emotion." Gideon stared at the wooden sphere in his palm. He slowly rolled up the sleeves of his dress shirt, exposing heavily corded forearms, and stepped up to the lane. He didn't adopt a casual stance. He widened his feet, squared his shoulders, and narrowed his eyes at the target rings. "The ramp is positioned at an approximate 30-degree incline," Gideon muttered, his eyes darting back and forth as he ran invisible calculations. Factoring in the weight of the projectile, the coefficient of friction on the synthetic lane, and the ambient humidity, a release velocity of 4 meters per second at an angle of, "Just throw the ball, Pythagoras," I yelled. Gideon drew his arm back with mechanical precision and hurled the ball. It did not hit the center ring. It did not even hit the board. The wooden sphere hit the very edge of the plastic ramp, bounced violently to the left, flew over the divider net, and clattered loudly into the neighboring lane, where it slowly rolled into the gutter of a 6-year-old's game. The child stopped and stared at the Alpha King. Gideon froze, his arm still suspended in the air. He looked at the empty lane, then at the child, and then down at his own hands, utterly bewildered by the failure of mathematics. "My calculations were flawless," he whispered in genuine shock. "The structural integrity of the ramp is compromised." I slapped a hand over my mouth, a laugh bursting out of my chest. "You missed the entire machine. You threw it into a different zip code." Gideon turned to glare at me, his jaw clenching. He opened his mouth to defend his physics, and then his composure completely broke. He didn't just smile, he laughed. It wasn't a polite, PR-approved chuckle. It was a deep, rumbling, full-chested laugh that vibrated beneath the obnoxious 8-bit arcade music. His eyes crinkled at the corners, the rigid tension melting out of his shoulders entirely. It was the most beautiful, unfiltered sound I had ever heard. My own laughter died instantly. The neon lights seemed to dim, leaving nothing but the sound of his laugh echoing in my ears. I stared at him, my cynical, hyper-independent heart skipping a fatal beat. I clutched my clipboard to my chest like a shield, the realization hitting me with the force of a runaway freight train. "Oh God," I thought, panic turning my blood to ice water. "I'm in love with him. I am completely, irreversibly screwed." The terrifying realization of my feelings was violently eclipsed 24 hours later by a literal act of God. We were touring the final venue option. The remote lakeside retreat, when the sky tore open. A torrential, entirely non-magical rainstorm turned the single-access road into a river of mud, trapping us inside the venue's uninsulated model cabin. The power grid failed at 7 p.m. "This is fine," I announced, aggressively ripping open a bag of stale vending machine pretzels by the weak glow of my phone flashlight. "We don't need electricity. We don't need heating. We are highly evolved professionals who can survive a minor infrastructural inconvenience." Gideon sat across from me on a violently uncomfortable plaid sofa. His dark eyes caught the harsh lid light of my phone. The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the thin window panes, but the cabin felt suffocatingly small. "You are pacing," Gideon noted, his voice an infuriatingly calm baritone over the thunder. "It is burning unnecessary caloric energy. I am pacing because if I stop moving, I will realize that I am trapped in the woods with no Wi-Fi, and I will start screaming," I snapped, throwing a pretzel at him. He caught it mid-air with lightning reflexes, completely deadpan, and ate it. "Your anxiety is illogical. The storm will pass by morning. The county will clear the road. There is no danger." "I'm not afraid of the storm, Gideon," I groaned, collapsing onto the opposite end of the sofa. The temperature in the room was plummeting, and my breath plumed white in the air. "I'm afraid of failing. If I don't fix these venues, I lose my business. If I lose my business, I have nothing. I am entirely alone." The words slipped out before my hyper-independent filter could stop them. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. Gideon shifted. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell me I was being dramatic. "You are not alone," he said quietly, the corporate stiffness bleeding out of his posture. "You carry the weight of everyone's expectations, Sloane. You do not have to carry mine. I hired you to manage a schedule, not to save my life. If this fails, the failure is mine." I looked at him, my heart doing a painful, erratic stutter. The cold air suddenly felt entirely irrelevant. The sheer, terrifying weight of his devotion hung in the dark space between us. "Go to sleep, Sloane," he commanded softly. I curled up on my end of the rigid cushions, exhausted by the panic and the freezing air. I closed my eyes, vowing to keep my distance. But the cold was relentless and sleep dragged me under. Hours later, I woke up. The storm had passed, leaving a quiet, freezing dawn. I wasn't cold anymore. In fact, I was incredibly, overwhelmingly warm. I blinked my eyes open and immediately stopped breathing. During the night, I had migrated. I was completely tangled in Gideon. My head was tucked beneath his chin. My leg hooked over his, and his massive, heavy arm was locked securely around my waist, pinning me flush against his chest. I could hear the slow, steady thump of his heart beneath his shirt. I was trapped in a cocoon of cedar and intense biological heat. And worst of all, he was already awake. The silence inside Gideon's sleek, bulletproof SUV was so loud it was practically vibrating. We had been rescued by a county plow at dawn. Now, we were trapped in gridlocked city traffic on the main suspension bridge, moving at an agonizingly slow pace. I stared out the passenger window, my brain replaying the mortifying reality of waking up practically grafted to the Alpha King. My walls were completely shattered. My fiercely defended independence felt like a fragile, ridiculous joke. I needed control. I needed logistics. "When we get back to the office," I said, my voice sounding entirely too high and fast, "we need to immediately review the catering contracts. And we should formalize our communication protocol. Emails only moving forward. We are blurring the lines of the vendor-client dynamic." Gideon's hands rested loosely on the leather steering wheel. He didn't glance at me. "The dynamic is perfectly functional." "It is highly dysfunctional," I argued, aggressively clicking my pen. "We slept on the same piece of furniture. You are a monarch. I am a coordinator. It is inappropriate for us to share thermal resources." Gideon slowly turned his head to look at me, a muscle feathering in his jaw. "You were shivering. It was a biological necessity." "It was a boundary violation," I lied, desperate to build my cynical armor back up. "I don't need you to rescue me from the cold, or from crowds, or from exploding sprinklers. I need you to act like a client so I can do my job and leave when the contract ends." The car in front of us crept forward 2 inches. Gideon didn't touch the gas pedal. "You are panicked," he observed calmly, his gaze tracking the frantic clicking of my pen. "I am professional," I countered, dropping the pen and grabbing my clipboard like a shield. I am trying to maintain the structural integrity of this operation. You are a distraction. You are a walking, breathing liability to my focus. I have not missed a single deadline, Gideon stated, completely unbothered by my outburst. My performance as your client has been statistically flawless. You take up too much oxygen, I yelled, gesturing wildly at the confined space of the SUV. And you look at me like I'm an equation you haven't solved yet. You are terrified, corrected softly. His voice dropped an octave, slipping into that gravelly, entirely uncorporate tone that made my knees weak. You are deliberately inventing structural failures in our working relationship because the alternative requires you to admit that you enjoyed the proximity. I absolutely did not. Gideon unbuckled his seatbelt. He leaned across the wide center console, completely invading my space. The scent of rain and deep woods flooded my senses, cutting off my oxygen supply. I froze, my back pressing into the passenger door as his large frame cast a shadow over me. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply reached out, his long fingers gently brushing against my cheek. With agonizing, methodical slowness, he tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His knuckles grazed the sensitive skin of my jaw, a touch so devastatingly soft it completely short-circuited my nervous system. Your logic is failing, Sloane, he whispered. His dark eyes locked onto my rapidly dilating pupils. He pulled back, clicked his seatbelt back into place, and finally pressed the gas pedal. I sat, frozen, against the leather seat, completely and utterly dismantled. 30 minutes later, I bolted out of the SUV the second we arrived at the city botanical gardens. I needed air. I needed space. Unfortunately, I had chosen to flee into an indoor, climate-controlled greenhouse. The air inside the massive glass dome was suffocatingly thick, dripping with heavy humidity and the overpowering scent of damp earth and exotic orchids. My blazer instantly felt like a straitjacket. Mrs. Sloane, Your Majesty, the eccentric head florist chirped, completely oblivious to the fact that I was actively hyperventilating. Shall we review the floral arches for the grand entryway? Yes, I gasped, wiping a bead of sweat from my temple. Let's review the arches. Rapidly. Over there. I pointed to a secluded corner of the greenhouse, hoping to put some distance between myself and the Alpha King. It was a fatal miscalculation. The walkway between the towering, violently pink orchids was barely 2 feet wide. Gideon followed me into the narrow aisle. The heat of the greenhouse was already oppressive, but the ambient heat radiating from his massive frame pushed the temperature to a dangerous extreme. He didn't complain about the humidity. He just stood directly behind me, completely boxing me in. The structural support for these vines is inadequate, Gideon murmured, leaning over my shoulder to inspect a trellis. He was so close that his chest lightly brushed my shoulder blade. My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was deafening in my own ears, a frantic, rhythmic betrayal of my cool, professional facade. Gideon paused. He slowly turned his head, his ear angling slightly toward me. As a shifter, his biology wasn't magic, but it was apex predator sharp. His enhanced hearing caught the frantic, irregular rhythm of my pulse. A slow, devastating smirk. The very first genuine, arrogant smirk I had ever seen on his face, pulled at the corner of his mouth. Your cardiovascular rate is currently hovering at 120 beats per minute, Gideon observed, his voice a low, teasing vibration right next to my ear. Are you experiencing a medical emergency, Sloane? It is the humidity, I hissed, refusing to turn around. I am experiencing thermal distress. Fascinating, he whispered, taking a half step closer. His hands came up, resting on either side of the trellis, effectively trapping me against the wall of thick green vines. And yet, your heart rate only spiked when I breached your personal perimeter. You are misinterpreting biological data, I stammered, my breath catching in my throat as he leaned in. The heavy, sweet scent of the orchids mixed dangerously with his cedar cologne. I am an expert in data analysis, Gideon countered softly. He lowered his head. The tip of his nose brushed the sensitive curve of my neck. I squeezed my eyes shut, a heavy, desperate heat pooling low in my stomach. The banter, the spreadsheets, the frantic logistics, it all burned away, leaving nothing but this crushing, electric tension. Tell me to step back, Sloane, he challenged quietly, his lips hovering a millimeter from my skin. Give me a single logical reason to retreat, and I will. My clipboard slipped from my fingers, hitting the damp earth with a soft thud. I turned my head, my lips parting as I angled my face up toward his. The air between us completely vanished. I can't, I breathed. His eyes darkened, all bureaucratic restraint snapping in an instant. He tilted my chin up, his gaze locking onto my mouth. Oh, I found the hydrangeas! The florist crashed through the vines like a caffeinated machete, holding a massive bucket of blue flowers. Gideon froze, his lips a breath away from mine. He closed his eyes, a pained, utterly human sigh escaping his chest as the moment shattered into a million pieces. The hydrangeas effectively saved my life and completely ruined my night. We survived the rest of the floral consultation in agonizing, hyper-professional silence. But by 11 o'clock that evening, the tension had mutated into full-blown logistical warfare. I was pacing the length of my cramped fourth-floor apartment, a lukewarm slice of pizza dangling from my mouth, while I aggressively typed one-handed. The lighting vendor had just voided their contract via an automated email. "You cannot automate cowardice," I shouted at my laptop, aggressively jabbing the backspace key. My carpal tunnel flared, sending a sharp electric protest up my forearm. My apartment was a chaotic monument to my hyper-independence. The coffee table was buried under color-coded swatches, my mismatched laundry was aggressively ignoring me from the corner, and the air smelled faintly of cheap jasmine incense and burnt garlic. A heavy, distinct knock rattled my deadbolt. I froze. Nobody knocked on my door at 11 at night, mostly because the hallway lighting flickered like a horror movie, and the stairs were a safety hazard. I crept to the peephole. Standing in the dim, yellow glow of the corridor was Gideon. He had traded his tailored suit jacket for a thick, dark Henley that clung to his broad shoulders. He was holding 2 massive paper bags from a high-end noodle shop. I yanked the door open. "How did you bypass the broken intercom?" "I walked past it," Gideon replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He ducked slightly to clear the doorframe, his massive frame instantly reducing my living room to the size of a shoebox. He didn't sneer at the scuffed baseboards or the chaotic explosion of paperwork. His dark eyes scanned the room, absorbing the domestic reality of my life with quiet intensity. "The lighting vendor canceled," I blurted, crossing my arms defensively. "I am handling it. You don't need to do a wellness check." "I am not here for a wellness check," Gideon said. He walked over to my cramped kitchenette, effortlessly navigating around a stack of rogue file folders, and set the bags on the counter. "I received the vendor alert. I hypothesized you would skip caloric intake to overcompensate. I brought scallion noozles. I have pizza," I lied, hiding my half-eaten tragic slice behind my back. He turned, arching a single devastating eyebrow. "You have a carbohydrate-based coping mechanism. Sit down, Sloane." I wanted to argue. I wanted to kick him out to protect my fragile emotional barricades. But the scent of rich broth, roasted garlic, and his underlying cedar cologne was an unbeatable combination. I slumped onto the floor beside the coffee table. Gideon didn't take the armchair. Instead, the Alpha King carefully lowered his massive frame onto my cheap, faded rug, sitting cross-legged right next to me. He handed me a pair of wooden chopsticks. Our fingers brushed. The jolt of heat was instantaneous, burning right through the exhaustion in my blood. I watched him neatly unpack the takeout, terrified by how flawlessly he fit into my messy, unstructured world. "I color-coded the backup vendors," Gideon murmured, pulling a stack of neon sticky notes from his pocket and placing them next to the noodles. I stared at the Alpha King, sitting on my cheap rug, eating noodles and organizing my life. The sheer, overwhelming rightness of it shattered my final defense. I was entirely, hopelessly in love with him, and I had to fire him immediately. 24 hours later, the Grand Hall was a terrifying monument to absolute perfection. The crystal chandeliers gleamed, casting a warm, flawless light over 200 impeccably dressed tables. The structural integrity of the floral arches was uncompromised. The lighting, courtesy of Gideon's late-night sticky notes, was atmospheric and precise. There were no crises, no exploding sprinklers, no collapsing pastries. Standing backstage in the heavy velvet-lined silence of the manager's office, I realized my worst nightmare had come true. The logistics were complete. I had no excuses left. I aggressively shoved the final vendor receipts into a manila envelope, my chest tight with a suffocating, irrational panic. If the event was over, the contract was over. If the contract was over, I had to face the reality of what was happening between us. The office door clicked open. Gideon walked in, fully dressed in his ceremonial alpha regalia. It wasn't primitive, it was a devastatingly sharp midnight blue tuxedo with subtle silver embroidery at the lapels. The lingering limp was completely masked by his commanding, magnetic stride. He looked like exactly what he was, a king ready to secure his reign. "The human press has arrived," Gideon noted, his deep voice vibrating off the wood-paneled walls. "The perimeter is secure." "Excellent," I said, my voice entirely too bright. I slapped the manila folder onto the mahogany desk. "Everything is greenlit, which means my job here is technically done. I've prepared the early termination paperwork." Gideon stopped moving. The air in the room suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. "Termination," he repeated, his tone dangerously flat. "A standard early release clause," I babbled, holding out a single sheet of paper with trembling fingers. "Since the event is running autonomously, I am waiving my final hourly fee. You sign there, and I will seamlessly exit through the loading dock before the appetizers are served." I was running away. I knew it, and he absolutely knew it. Gideon stared at the paper. He didn't blink. He didn't reach for his silver pen. Instead, his gaze slowly lifted from the desk to my face. The bureaucratic mask was gone. In its place was a sharp, unyielding focus that made my pulse roar in my ears. "You are attempting to optimize our separation," he murmured, his voice dropping into a deadly, velvet hum. "I am attempting to be a fish," I countered, backing up slightly as he took a slow, deliberate step forward. "You are terrified of the variables you cannot control," Gideon corrected softly. He took another step. The heavy oak desk was completely blocking my escape. "Sign the paper, Gideon." He reached out. But he didn't take the contract. His large, warm hands closed gently over mine, slipping the clipboard entirely out of my grip. He tossed it onto the desk with a dismissive clatter. Without breaking eye contact, Gideon reached behind him. Click. The heavy metal lock of the backstage office door engaged. My lungs forgot how to process oxygen. We were trapped in a 10 by 10 soundproof room, the music from the ballroom completely muffled. "I am not signing anything, Sloane," Gideon whispered, closing the final inch of space between us. The sound of the deadbolt locking was the loudest thing I had ever heard. "You can't hostage a vendor," I gasped, desperately reaching behind me, my hands hitting the solid edge of the mahogany desk. "That is a severe violation of human resources protocol. You fired yourself 30 seconds ago," Gideon pointed out smoothly. He planted his hands on the edge of the desk on either side of my hips, caging me in. "You are no longer a vendor, therefore protocol is irrelevant." His proximity was completely devastating. The faint scent of cedar and rain wrapped around me, cutting off my air supply. The ambient heat radiating from his massive frame made my meticulously planned exit strategy dissolve into absolute panic. I snatched my clipboard back off the desk, wielding the aluminum edge like a highly ineffective shield. "Step back," I ordered, my voice shaking as I pointed the pen clip at his chest. "I know what you're doing. I see the data. Your pulse is elevated. Your pupils are dilated. But it is just a biological glitch, Gideon. It's stress adrenaline from the gala." Gideon didn't retreat. He simply tilted his head, watching my frantic meltdown with an infuriatingly calm, deeply affectionate gaze. "It is not a glitch," he murmured, his chest lightly brushing the edge of my clipboard. "It is," I insisted, talking faster and faster as my hyper-independent walls began to spectacularly collapse. "You are a shifter. Your biology is predisposed to illogical, hormonal pair bonding. But I am human. I believe in free will. I believe in choices. I do not believe in the universe hijacking my autonomy just because we survived a plumbing disaster." "Sloane, don't you dare say it," I warned him, jabbing the clipboard half an inch closer to his sternum. "Do not drop the M word. If you say it, it makes it real, Sel. If you say it, I become a logistical variable in a royal pack dynamic, and I lose my entire life. So keep your biology to yourself, Your Majesty." I was breathless, my chest heaving, practically vibrating with cynical terror. I expected him to argue. I expected him to use his alpha authority to dominate the conversation, or pull out a spreadsheet to mathematically disprove my fears. Instead, Gideon broke every single rule he had ever lived by. He reached up, gently pushing the clipboard down. His large hand slid to the back of my neck, his long fingers tangling in the messy hairs that had escaped my bun. His touch was an anchor, grounding me completely. He didn't roar. He didn't command. He just smiled, a soft, blindingly genuine smile that reached his dark eyes. He leaned down, his lips brushing the sensitive shell of my ear, sending a violent electric shiver straight down my spine. "Mate," he whispered, quietly, once. Single word hit me like a tactical strike. My clipboard hit the floor. The world tilted violently on its axis, and before my brain could even attempt to calculate a response, I shoved him back, yanked the door unlocked, and sprinted blindly into the chaotic neon lights of the city streets. The city air was sharp and bitterly cold, stinging my lungs as I sprinted away from the grand hall. I expected to hear the heavy thud of boots behind me. I expected the Alpha King to give chase, to let primal instinct override his bespoke tuxedo and drag me back into that velvet-lined office. But the sidewalk remained empty. I stopped at the corner of Fifth and Elm, gasping for breath beneath a flickering streetlight. The distant, muffled bass from the Unity Gala thumped against the pavement, a cruel reminder of the perfectly optimized event I had just abandoned. He hadn't chased me. A bizarre hollow ache bloomed in my chest. "Of course he didn't chase you," my cynical brain snapped. "He respects protocol. You instituted a boundary. He is adhering to the data." I practically collapsed against the brick wall of a closed bodega, burying my face in my hands. The ghost of his touch still burned on the back of my neck. That single whispered word, "mate," echoed in my head, completely dismantling every logical defense I had spent 28 years building. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I flinched, staring at the screen. It was a text from Gideon. It wasn't a demand to return. It wasn't a feral declaration of dominance. It was a bulleted list. Hypothesis: your flight response is triggered by a fear of lost autonomy. Fact: a mate bond is not a biological cage. It is a dual authentication security protocol. My resources are yours to deploy. Your autonomy remains uncompromised. Fact: you are the most brilliant variable in my existence. Action item: I will not pursue. I will wait for you to review the data. I stared at the glowing text, a choked, watery laugh tearing out of my throat. The man was using corporate formatting to confess his undying devotion. It was the most romantic, absurdly infuriating thing I had ever read. I walked the 10 blocks back to my apartment in a daze. I unlocked my door, stepping into the chaotic, messy sanctuary of my hyper-independent life. The silence inside was deafening. I looked at the rogue files on the counter, the mismatched laundry in the corner, and the cheap rug where a king had sat eating scallion noodles. For the first time in my life, the chaos didn't feel like freedom. It just felt incredibly, suffocatingly lonely. 2 hours later, the grand hall was a glittering triumph of cross-cultural diplomacy. I had snuck back into the venue through the loading dock, slipping past the catering crew like a phantom. I was currently crouching in the dark, elevated sound booth, peering through the glass at the massive ballroom below. The event was flawless. Humans and shifters were mingling around the meticulously arranged table 2. No one was fighting, no one was bleeding. Gideon stood at the central podium on the grand stage, framed by the floral arches I had designed. He looked magnificent, commanding the attention of the 500 dignitaries with absolute, quiet authority. The shifter council members nodded approvingly in the front row. Esteemed guests. Gideon's deep voice boomed perfectly through the acoustic system I had calibrated. We gather tonight to finalize a treaty of mutual efficiency. He looked down at his perfectly formatted, color-coded speech cards. This was the moment that would secure his crown. This was the logical, unfeeling rhetoric the council demanded. But Gideon stopped. He stared at the cards for 3 agonizingly long seconds. The silence in the ballroom stretched tight, vibrating with sudden tension. Slowly, Gideon raised his hands and ripped the heavy cardstock entirely in half. The Alpha Council visibly flinched. Efficiency, Gideon murmured into the microphone, his voice losing its bureaucratic polish, is a coward's metric. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I pressed my hands against the cold glass of the sound booth, my heart slamming into my ribs. I have spent my tenure optimizing this pack, Gideon continued, his gaze lifting. He completely ignored the council, scanning the dark perimeter of the room. I believed that controlling variables prevented failure. I believed vulnerability was a logistical error. He stepped out from behind the safety of the podium. His slight limp was visible, unhidden, and unmasked. But true integration, true strength, does not exist on a spreadsheet. Gideon's voice dropped, rumbling with a raw, terrifying honesty that silenced the room. It exists in chaos. It exists in the terrifying gamble of relying on someone who refuses to follow your rules. Someone who drops clipboards, argues over table assignments, and builds order out of sheer, uncompromising will. He stopped walking. His dark eyes locked directly onto the tinted glass of the sound booth. He knew I was there. "I do not want an efficient reign," Gideon said quietly, the microphone picking up the heavy rasp of his breath. "I want a partnership, and I am willing to completely dismantle my protocol to earn it." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. The dignitaries were frozen, completely stunned by the unraveling of the stoic Alpha King. Gideon didn't wait for the council's approval. He turned away from the stage entirely. With slow, deliberate steps, he walked down the central staircase and stepped onto the polished wood of the main dance floor. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, murmuring in bewildered shock. He stopped directly in the center of the room, looking up at the sound booth. "Sloan," he called out, abandoning the microphone entirely. His voice boomed, raw and unamplified, cutting through the cavernous space. My breath caught. I was paralyzed in the dark, my hands trembling against the soundboard. "I have reviewed the metrics of your independence," Gideon shouted, his tone completely deadpan despite the sheer absurdity of the situation. "Your refusal to delegate tasks is statistically unsustainable. You require a cosigner on your emotional liabilities." A human reporter in the third row frantically started taking notes. "I am offering a hostile takeover of your heart," Gideon continued, ignoring the horrified gasps of his advisors. "I bring exceptional bone density, optimal thermal regulation, and a complete willingness to be managed by you indefinitely." I choked on a hysterical sob. He was doing it. The man who hated public attention, who treated every interaction like a tax audit, was publicly humiliating himself using spreadsheet logic to prove his devotion. "The variables are terrifying," Gideon said, his voice dropping slightly, losing the shout, but carrying clearly in the dead, silent room. He raised his hand, offering his open palm to the empty space above him. "But the data is conclusive. Come down here, Sloan. Review the terms." He stood there, perfectly still, his hand outstretched in front of 500 people, risking his crown, his dignity, and his carefully curated image on a single, terrifying variable, me. I looked at my clipboard lying on the soundboard. I looked at the dark, empty booth around me, and then I turned and practically kicked the sound booth door off its hinges. I didn't take the elevator. Elevators were too slow, too reliant on electrical grids that could fail at any moment. Instead, I took the spiral service stairs, my heels clicking a frantic, erratic rhythm against the metal grates. My breath was tearing through my lungs, a chaotic mix of sheer adrenaline and complete, utter surrender. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom loomed ahead. I hit the brass handles with both hands, shoving them open with a loud, resounding crack that echoed through the cavernous space. 500 heads turned in terrifying unisons. The collective scent of expensive perfume, nervous sweat, and melting beeswax candles hit me like a physical wall. The silence was absolute, heavy with the weight of political scandal. But I didn't care about the human dignitaries. I didn't care about the glaring shifter council. My eyes locked entirely onto the center of the dance floor. Gideon was exactly where I had left him. His hand was still outstretched, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that made the massive crystal chandelier above him seem completely dim. I marched onto the polished hardwood. My messy bun was practically unraveling. My blazer was wrinkled, and I had absolutely no logistical plan. I was flying completely blind. The crowd parted, stepping back to create a wide, agonizingly long aisle. "Your public speaking is a catastrophic liability," I announced, my voice shaking just enough to betray my terror. I closed the distance, stopping mere inches from his outstretched hand. You cannot propose a hostile takeover at a diplomatic function. It is a severe breach of protocol. Gideon didn't lower his hand. The corner of his mouth twitched, a devastating micro-expression of pure triumph. My metrics indicated that a dramatic, high-visibility gesture would bypass your defensive perimeter. "Your metrics are arrogant," I whispered, staring up at his sharp, perfectly structured face. Up close, the cedar and rain scent of him was intoxicating, completely overriding my senses. "You risked your entire crown." "For what? To prove a point?" "To prove a fact," Gideon corrected smoothly. His deep voice vibrated in the silent room, meant only for me. "The crown is merely an administrative title. You, Sloane, are the infrastructure. I cannot operate without you." My hyper-independent brain scrambled for a witty retort, a cynical defense, a reason to run back to my lonely, chaotic apartment. But looking at the Alpha King, standing there with his slight limp, his ruined speech cards, and his terrifyingly honest heart, the walls finally, completely collapsed into dust. "Fine," I breathed, my shoulders dropping as I surrendered entirely. I lifted my hand, placing it squarely into his waiting palm. "But I am strictly auditing your emotional liabilities." Gideon's fingers instantly curled around mine. The heat of his skin was an electric shock, anchoring me to the floor. "Audit approved," he murmured. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for permission from his counsel. Gideon pulled me flush against his chest, his free hand sliding to the small of my back to completely eliminate the remaining space between us. The sheer size of him enveloped me, a solid, immovable fortress of heat and stability. I tilted my head up just as he leaned down, and the collision was devastating. The kiss wasn't a feral, chaotic clash of teeth. It was exactly like Gideon, methodical, deep, and overwhelmingly intentional. His thumbs traced the line of my jaw as his lips parted mine, demanding completely and yielding entirely at the same time. A heavy, intoxicating tension pooled low in my stomach. The ambient noise of the ballroom, the gasps, the scattered, hesitant applause, faded into absolute static. I tangled my fingers into his perfectly styled hair, ruining it completely, and he groaned softly against my mouth, pulling me impossibly closer. 6 months later, the morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our new downtown penthouse suite, highlighting the chaotic explosion of fabric swatches scattered across the massive glass dining table. "You cannot seat the Minister of Agriculture next to the head florist," I argued, tapping my red pen aggressively against the master seating chart for our upcoming mating ceremony. They had a dispute over fertilizer sourcing in 2024. It will be an absolute bloodbath. Gideon sat beside me, sipping a violently dark espresso. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a tight black t-shirt, completely devoid of his bureaucratic armor. He looked relaxed. He looked devastating. "The minister has conceded the dispute," Gideon noted, leaning over my shoulder. The heat of his chest pressed us back, sending a familiar, highly distracting shiver down my spine. "Furthermore, the proximity will force a diplomatic resolution. It will force me to hire extra security," I muttered, trying to ignore the way his lips brushed against the sensitive shell of my ear. "We are not hiring security for our own ceremony," he murmured, his hands sliding down to rest warmly on my hips. "It's not a ceremony, it's a lifetime contract," I corrected, leaning back against him with a contented sigh. "And the logistics are an absolute nightmare." "The logistics," Gideon whispered, turning me slightly so he could press a slow, lingering kiss to my neck, his breath ghosting over my pulse point, "are entirely your department. I am merely here to manage your biological temperature." I laughed, dropping my red pen onto the glass desk. The spreadsheets could wait. The schedules could wait. I turned in his arms, looping my hands around his neck as he pulled me into his lap, finally realizing that the greatest logistical triumph of my life was surrendering control to the one man who loved my chaos. We know we're wiping away tears over that intense reunion, too. But if you think this alpha was obsessed, you haven't seen anything yet. Finding a massive, naked, furiously grumbling man bleeding in the snow outside your failing vet clinic? Bad. Click the video on your screen right now.